An African sat in front of us on the way home from kindergarten the other day. My son said, "That man is black." I shushed him. Yes, and he probably speaks English. Here in Kyiv, he had never been that close to a black person. The African showed no sign that he understood. With regard to the gypsies in our neighborhood, I've told my son it's impolite to talk about people in the third person when they're right there. However, with gypsies, it's not an issue. None of them speak English. Before the African reached his stop, I composed a little talk in my mind. I told him that there are a few Africans in Kyiv, mostly as students. They represent the best of Africa. You can expect them to be intelligent and polite. He should certainly be tolerant. More than that, he should expand his horizons by talking to them, hearing what they have to say. I had given quite a bit of thought to this discussion. I followed on with some of the ideas that got John Derbyshire excluded from polite society in the United States. Just as my English, Mayflower, and later German ancestors who came to America long ago in wooden boats, the Africans in Ukraine are pioneers. They've come to a cold country where they're a conspicuous minority to study in a foreign language. The problems don't start until there are enough of them to form their own communities. I have had only a couple of instances to observe since I've come to Ukraine. The African students in Ternopil are numerous enough to be seen lollygagging on the sidewalks in rather rough conversation, listening to rap music and chatting up the local girls. The second-hand clothes vendors in the Shulyavka district near the metro were somewhat the same. But on the other hand, the students one sees in our neighborhood are almost always alone, they keep to themselves, and they don't cause any trouble. The British, American, and European blacks that I've met in Rotary and professional life here have been quite representative of their station in life. There has long been a very slight African presence in the Eastern Slavic world. The great-grandfather of Russia's national poet, Alexander Pushkin, was a successful Russian general. There is a smattering of young mulatto adults here in Kyiv, the results of Soviet war push to make friends in Africa. The Africans must have gone home. You never see mixed couples old enough to be the parents of such people. You very occasionally see young and apparently unmarried mixed couples. I told my son that every country that has a substantial African population has problems with racism, violence, and unemployment. Certainly, we whites can be prejudiced, but though nobody wants to say so, Africans can be quite prejudiced themselves against both white people and each other. The prejudice of Hutus against Tutsis leads to a genocide. And the prejudice against whites is leading to a genocide about which all right-thinking white people are conspicuously silent in Zimbabwe and South Africa. South Africa's new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has made it clear that he plans to expropriate without compensation private property owned by white citizens. The Western media remains totally silent. The hypocrisy is stunning. One can only imagine their outrage if any white government attempted to dispossess a black minority. Overseas, serving the military, I observed that exposure to black American soldiers aroused in Japanese and Vietnamese the same kind of fear and prejudice that in us whites is called racism. The blacks in the French army had done the same a generation before our arrival in Vietnam. With no coaching from Americans, the mestizo majorities in Honduras, Peru, and Brazil have developed a similar antipathy toward their black citizens. And the good-hearted Swedes, with no legacy whatsoever of slavery or colonialism, are on a crash course for developing racist sentiment. The large numbers of Africans and Middle Easterns they've allowed in are simply not mixing with the Swedes They remain on unemployment and they contribute to violence. The immigrants in Sweden show themselves to be virulently more racist than the studiously tolerant Swedes. See the YouTube blog of Swedish immigrant, Angry Foreigner, and my review of the Swedish story. You can find them in the live journal text of this YouTube video. One must conclude that the problem surrounding blacks is not white racism, but the nature of the black people themselves. The problems are inherent in every large group of blacks, wherever and among whomever they are situated, even and perhaps especially among themselves. As a white citizen of Washington, D.C., I experienced prejudice every time I dealt with the majority black city government, in tax matters, registering my car, getting a driver's license, and so on. Though I tried to be as inoffensive as I could, a mouse, black employees gave me the runaround. In the 1970s, they withheld my $1,000 tax refund. I had to take them to court to get it back. Now, I could easily handle it. I'm a smart enough guy who had a good job, but I likewise didn't ignore it. I write elsewhere about my sly trick of toca el dos para el español to avoid blacks when dealing with U.S. government agencies. I told my son further that there are so many African and Middle Eastern immigrants in Western Europe that it has become impossible even to ask the question of whether they're causing problems. While the problems themselves are totally evident, it is against the law in England, Denmark, Sweden, and Canada even to mention them. Liberal governments have come to rely on their votes, and they fine and imprison politicians who question the wisdom of allowing more immigration. Governments and media hide the statistics on immigrant crime, unemployment, fertility, welfare dependency, and so on. Media moguls silence dissenting voices. The travails of conservative bloggers on YouTube and Twitter are legend. African immigration is a problem that must be nipped in the bud before talking about it becomes taboo. Ukraine, like every other country, has a full right to choose whom they award immigrant, student, and even tourist visas. They should observe the problems that have arisen in Western Europe and are appearing in the United States and Canada, and be very chary of admitting too many Africans under any pretext. There's a vast difference between private tolerance and the public policy of diversity. Public policy must be applied equally to all individuals. On the other hand, we as private citizens, still in most places, have the right to choose whom we accept as friends and acquaintances. We can apply tolerance with discretion. Diversity, on the other hand, is forced on a population by public policy. It has not worked. One has only to look at the extreme discomfort it has brought in the areas of residential desegregation, school desegregation, and workplace desegregation. The races, all races, are simply more comfortable with their own kind. We can appreciate and laud tolerance where it exists. It can never be forced, and attempting to do so is a catastrophe. Ukraine is favored by its very backwardness. The tide of refugees washing over Western Europe does not want to come here. In fact, these supposedly desperate, presumptive war refugees complain loudly when the relocation authorities attempt even to place them in a Central European member of the European Union, such as Romania or Bulgaria, instead of the lands of milk and honey, such as Germany. The residents of Yagotin, about 60 miles east of us here in Kyiv, successfully resisted the resettlement of a bunch of Syrians after Ukrainian President Poroshenko caved in to EU pressure to accept them. I like to say that Ukraine is too poor to be that stupid. The Syrians themselves may have been relieved to be rejected. We in Ukraine have to be happy that the Visegrad countries are putting up such spirited resistance against overbearing European Union pressure with regard to refugees. Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic are Ukraine's bulwark to the west. I'm not sure that our politicians are strong enough to resist enforced resettlement. Thank God the countries who are close enough to have seen the catastrophe in Western Europe firsthand are fighting that fight for us. I told my son that all of that said, the few Africans here are not causing problems and may well be worth getting to know. The lesson is that diversity in small doses can expand a person's worldview. It calls for the virtue of tolerance. On the other hand, diversity in large doses is no virtue whatsoever. As Western Europe is proving, it is suicide. The text of this presentation, as I've mentioned, is on my LiveJournal site. Thank you for listening. Goodbye from Kyiv.